Okay, so we're back with Chapter 7, Law and Ethics. This is a chapter I'd suggest reading through very carefully. It's a lot of terms and ideas coming at you. So, press rights. Press rights fall into two categories: privileges and protections for journalistic activities, and then access to government operations and records. And the slide shows you the first part of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Congress shall make no law prohibiting law respecting an establishment of free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So again, we have these rights for journalistic activities, and then we also have access. And access is going to be really important. You'll see, especially when it comes to libel, things like libel. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Freedom of Information Act as well. Privilege and protection for journalists and sources in their stories. So that's the fair report privilege, is that if there are public documents, we can report on them. You know, even if they say bad things about good people, we can report on them. Allows journalists to report anything said in official government proceedings. They have to be fair and accurate, right? And there's also something called the opinion privilege. We are entitled to have our opinions and protects written opinions from libel suits. There's a distinction between facts and opinion. And fair comment and criticism allows journalists to criticize performers, politicians, and other matters of public interest, so that we're allowed to have opinion on them. If something's prominent, we can have criticism of them. I went to Panama, did some reporting there. Journalists were not allowed to criticize the president of Panama. There were gag laws. If they did criticize him in certain ways, they could be taken to court. And just by virtue of being able to be taken to court, the journalists were not able to do their work, right? Even if they won, ultimately, they spent so much time in court that they couldn't recover stories. So it's very important that we have this right to criticize our government. Freedom from newsroom searches, right? That they have to have a warrant, they have to have a reason why they're going through it. This is our private material. And then there's something called shield laws. Those are state by state. There's not a federal shield law, but those allow reporters to protect their sources. So journalistic access, open courtrooms, the issues, does the media coverage harm the trial defendants? Is there so much coverage? I don't know if people remember the case of Drew Peterson, but he was played by Rob Lowe in a TV movie. He allegedly murdered at least two of his wives, possibly more, but it got a ton of coverage here. Could he get a fair trial in the Chicago area? Do cameras turn the courtrooms into circuses? And should press be banned from some trials? The Supreme Court comes down on the side of the media of the court remaining open unless there's an overriding interest in closing it. Journalistic access, again, to open meetings. Should public officials be allowed to make decisions behind closed doors? And generally we say no. At one point, does government secrecy become a threat? Are they making decisions behind our backs that will affect us? And the laws vary by state, but generally if the government board or commission receives revenue from taxes, they're subject to open meeting laws. And I remember even being given a card when I was a young journalist. If they were trying to go into private session, I'd say, according to the Sunshine Laws, you cannot make this meeting private, and I would get up and read it. Never had to do that, but it was good to have that possibility if we needed to. But the idea that because public bodies are making decisions with taxpayer money, that the public, through the journalists, have the right to know what happens in those meetings. So open records, the issues, should government records be accessible to the public? Generally, yes. Sometimes I'll talk about national security, but the idea is who decides what's off limits. The law, the 1966 Freedom of Information Act, that's the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, that I was talking to you about, requires the federal agencies to make most of their records available, and actually they have to give them back if there's a request, a written request, and there's a template that you fill out to write a request to a government agency asking for certain information through a certain time. And then they're supposed to get it back to you relatively quickly. Every state has their own version of FOIA. Again, it's called FOIA. Reporter's Guide to Getting in Trouble, stories that can get you jailed. Contempt of court, right? Piss off the judge. Trespassing, going onto somebody's private property. I know a reporter who went into people's garbage cans, but if the garbage can wasn't on the property, is it really trespassing? Sedition, right? That's a big one. You don't want to be a traitor to your country, but that can be used against you. National security concerns are kind of a broad, sweeping statement. If you want to see something, Kill the Messenger might be a good movie to check about. Sedition. Stories that can get you sued are stories that are libelous, that are an invasion of privacy, and then breach of contract, if you violate a contract that you're part of. Stories that can get you fired if you plagiarize, right? Just like here, it can get you an F in class. Plagiarizing is even more severe in an industry that relies on the originality of its writers, so that can get you fired. It relies on the truth of their stories, so fabrication gets you fired. Lapses in ethics, right? You don't want to be dating your source, generally, telling their story to get ahead, to get gains. It can be a conflict of interest. Stories that can get you angry phone calls if you're biased, if you show bias in your stories, if they're in bad taste, they're kind of gross or vulgar. And if you mess up, I would get called in at the radio station because I was told I mispronounced the state that we live in. It's Illinois, not Illinois, and so bloopers will get angry calls. Understanding libel. Who can sue for libel? Living people. Dead people cannot sue. Small groups, large groups. Jewish American, Mexican Americans can't sue. Who is it that gets sued? It's usually the publication. Sometimes it's also the author. Libel is false statements, so they have to be false. They have to be defamatory. You can't say something good about somebody and have it be libel. It has to be published. It has to appear. Now, the definitions of that can vary. That can just mean that it's on the internet, and there have to be identifiable plaintiffs, and the defendants must be at fault through negligence or malice. So they made a mistake, either unwittingly or purposefully. Okay, how do you defend yourself? Well, the truth is the best defense. Consent, right? Privilege, that you had the right to those documents. How can I avoid libel? You verify the material. You allow people to defend themselves. If you're going to print something that's going to show somebody in a bad light, you call them and get them to talk to you first, and not at 11:59 if the story's due at midnight. You give them enough time to reasonably respond, and if they won't talk to you, say, in your story that they refuse to comment, but you give them that chance. And remember, public officials often make unofficial claims. So you want to get these things on the record. And if you make a mistake, you correct it. The Cherry Sisters apparently were a very bad band, and the newspaper said that, and then they sued in Iowa. And the Iowa Supreme Court said any performance which is public, to the public is invited, can be freely criticized. So Cherry Sisters, sorry, you were bad. We said you were bad. And you can't protect yourself against that because you had a public performance. The public was invited to it. The public's allowed to say what they think, and the press is allowed to say what they think. So any editor may publish reasonable comments on that performance. So now we've got to understand the vocabulary of libel. There's something called actual malice. A little bit different than, malice is bad intent, but actual malice just means knowing you are lying or disregarding the truth. Opinion, an idea that doesn't claim to be factual. Slander is defamation, so it's like libel, but it's spoken, so that's the main difference. A public official is someone who exercises power or influence in government affairs versus a public figure as someone who has acquired fame or notoriety. Right? So a public official could be the head of I'm going to stay with Chicago, but of the Chicago Public Schools, whereas a public figure could be Paris Hilton, could be somebody who's famous. Invasion of privacy, you can invade their privacy through intrusion, by trespassing on their privacy, by secretly surveilling it. There was by misrepresenting yourself. You always want to present yourself as a reporter. By publicly disclosing private facts that are intimate and would be offensive to many people, including the person whose privacy is violated. You can also put somebody in a false light, make them look a certain way, anything that portrays somebody inaccurately. Appropriation, right? You can't use somebody's name, photo, or words to endorse or sell a product. I think that's the case where Michael Jordan was being used by Dominics for something, and he sued them. He gave the money away to charity, but he didn't win because they were appropriating his image. Your story might get spiked or killed if you have vulgar language, offensive topics, if there's a conflict of interest, right? You're benefiting from it some way that if there's legal or ethical issues, if there's reporting flaws, you always want to have check your work, particularly on those stories. And sometimes you will have to run it by a lawyer. Ethical pitfalls, so not necessarily legal, but ethically, you want to avoid deception, lying or misrepresenting yourself to obtain information. So present yourself as a reporter, not the ComEd guy. Conflict of interest, you don't want to accept gifts or favors from sources or promoting social or political causes. So even with a home for developmentally disabled, I said, I really shouldn't take this T-shirt that you gave me. But definitely you don't want to go out to lunch or get flights or hotels paid for by places. Travel journalism has its own kind of mess with that. So a lot of unethical reporting in there, I would say. Bias, but that's probably bias. I've known some travel reporters. Bias, slanting a story to manipulating facts to sway opinion. Fabricating, making stuff up that you know isn't true. Theft, getting your information unlawfully or without a source's permission. Burning a source, deceiving or betraying the confidence of a source. So you tell them, I'm not going to share this information with anybody, but you go ahead and you do that. You burned a source. Plagiarizing, passing off someone else's words or ideas as your own. Ethics, when you face an ethical dilemma, you have to think about what purpose does it serve to print this? Why am I going ahead and printing it? Why is it important? Who gains? Who loses? Is it worth it? What best serves the reader? And then there's something called the Journalistic Code of Ethics. We are not given a license to practice journalism, and that license can't be taken away because it doesn't exist. In Panama, there was, right? So the government issued licenses. All we can do is have a code of ethics. The Society of Professional Journalists is an organization, a national organization of journalism, and they do have a code that they periodically revisit and update. Code of Ethics says seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable. Now, you can't be, you probably could be thrown out of the organization, but you can't get your journalistic license taken away because there is one. Hopefully you will be shamed by other journalists and by other journalism outlets, and you'll lose your job, but that's not necessarily true. This is a code of ethics. Okay, do they love us? 62% of Americans say they don't trust the press. Lovely. And probably the numbers are even higher under the Trump administration. 59% think newspapers care more about profits than public interest. So we're going to leave there, and we're going to pick up next time with Chapter 8, Digital Journalism. Thank you.